Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 209 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about building empathy with the Iceberg model, which sounds a bit like a magic trick. Using just this iceberg will build empathy, but it's not really. It's just a good way to shift your perspective to be a bit more curious about the people around you. Okay, let's get into this topic right now. Now, recording this episode, I have my dog lying under the desk here, so if you hear snorting or sighing noises, it's most probably not me. Okay, so leadership can be challenging and frustrating, especially if your team aren't quite doing what you want them to. If you can build empathy for your people, you'll have a better chance of remaining calm and patient with them. And that's why in this episode, I want to introduce a model which can help us to build this empathy. I like to keep it simple, and this model is quite simple, easy to use, and just a good way to help us shift our perspective. So firstly, why should leaders bother to build empathy? Now, the definition of empathy I'd like to use here is that of cognitive empathy or perspective taking, as described in an article in Berkeley's Greater Good magazine, which I'll link to in the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/209. Now, basically this means you're able to identify and understand other people's emotions. For leaders, empathy is a very handy thing to have, because it can help leaders more easily spot situations where team members are upset, stressed, or feeling other negative emotions. You can also use the emotional information gathered to adjust your approach to leading your team. And you can also try to avoid unintended consequences by being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And this will hopefully help you to act in a way that brings out the best in the team, or at least minimizes the worst outcomes. Now, one other thing to think about here in terms of empathy is sometimes empathy, it does take two forms. It can be emotional empathy, where you look to understand people's emotions that they may be feeling. But there's also what I mentioned before, the cognitive empathy, which is about trying to understand the way they think or the logic behind the way they're thinking. So these two perspectives can add up to create a whole picture of both emotions and the logical thinking of the other person. And there's a related article I'll put in the show notes page as well about 4 ways leaders can build empathy in the workplace and why it matters, on a very similar theme. But this episode is all about the Iceberg model. Now, the Iceberg model is not a model where you punch in numbers and get an answer. It's actually much simpler than that. Now, I like to use this model as a simple metaphor during training courses and coaching. It's particularly useful when discussing topics like having difficult conversations or managing behaviour or performance problems in a team, and the concept tends to really resonate with people. People know what an iceberg is and that we can generally only see the tip of the iceberg above the waterline. Below the waterline is more iceberg, and it's usually a huge chunk of ice under the water, but we don't usually know how much or what it looks like because we can't see it. And you've probably seen images of the sideways iceberg where at the top you can see the tip of the iceberg, which is very small, compared to the huge block of ice underneath the water. And that's what I'm referring to here, the fact that we can see only a tiny portion of the iceberg if we just look at the top above the waterline. So where does this iceberg model come from? Well, based on my research, there's a few different origins of this iceberg model floating around, pardon the pun. One origin comes from the anthropologist Edward T. Hall, who wrote about visible and invisible cultures in his book Beyond Culture. Now, he doesn't appear to call it an iceberg directly, but many have extrapolated that meaning from his work. Now, the neurologist Sigmund Freud also refers to the iceberg model of human consciousness, where there's this pre-conscious, conscious, and unconscious mind, with our conscious behaviour representing only about 10% of our whole psyche. And then even the author Ernest Hemingway had his iceberg theory, or sometimes called the theory of omission, in fiction writing, which refers to what is written on the page only being part of the story behind a character's actions in a novel. So as you can see, there's a few different cited sources for this type of model, The simple point of the iceberg model is that we can observe what is at the tip of the iceberg above the waterline. But there's a whole lot of hidden stuff going on beneath the surface which drives what may be going on above the water. So how does this model help us? Well, as a leader, it's good to have an appreciation of other points of view, other perspectives. If we're only stuck on what we are feeling or thinking, we'll have a tendency to take a my way or the highway approach. We may overlook good ideas from other sources or ignore people's feelings in the workplace. And I like to use this model to demonstrate that what we see above the waterline is only a very small part of the story when it comes to how your people are behaving. So what else is there beneath the surface? At the tip of the iceberg, we can see what people do, what they say, and the body language they show as three broad categories. Obviously underneath that there's lots of different body language we could look for, or the tone of voice and all this sort of stuff. Now beneath the waterline is where there's much more going on. Now we can't see what people are thinking, feeling, what they believe or what they fear. And we don't necessarily know what past experiences a person has had or the values that they hold dear just by looking at them. And these are all strong drivers behind a person's behaviour. These all lie beneath the waterline. So keeping this in mind helps us to be more open-minded about what is happening in the workplace. Instead of rushing straight to judgment about somebody's behaviour, it can be helpful to be curious instead, and this might mean asking yourself, I wonder what's behind that person's curious behaviour. Now, keeping an open mind also helps you to reduce your own emotional response, because we're more likely to be open to alternative explanations for what's going on. Now, the use of alternative explanations, or sometimes called cognitive restructuring, comes from the field of cognitive behavioural therapy. And now, I'm not a therapist and I'm not pretending to be one, but it is a very useful concept we can borrow from that field. Now, put simply, it involves considering alternative explanations for an event that has occurred rather than simply jumping to an automatic thought. So, for example, your team member comes late into work. Automatically, you may think they are lazy, forgetful, or not committed. But if we pause to consider alternative explanations, it may be possible that the team member, for example, may have had some sort of family problem at home, or there may have been an accident on the way to work, or perhaps there was an early morning networking event which the team member attended before work, making them come in a little bit late. Now, the point of doing this exercise is not to correctly guess what has happened. Rather, it is simply to open yourself up to the possibilities, and this type of reframing can reduce the magnitude of our own emotional response. This helps us to manage our emotions, remain calm and composed, and hopefully guide a more constructive response rather than one based on very strong emotion. Now, the iceberg model can help us more easily consider these alternative explanations, increasing our empathy in the moment. And there's a related article I'll put in the show notes page as well about how to manage your emotions for better leadership. That's a good one to check out. You can do that at the show notes page, thoughtfleader.com/209. Now, one thing I want to note here is that just because you have empathy and are considering the other person's perspective, it doesn't mean you need to stand by and accept poor behavior. The reasoning behind the alternative explanations technique is to help you manage your own emotional response, but it is not about letting people walk all over you or ignoring dysfunctional behavior. And just because you have empathy does not mean you need to go overboard trying to satisfy your team members' needs. Leadership is not about always being the nice girl or guy. Sometimes you will need to deliver difficult messages to people who need to hear them. This can still be done respectfully, and empathy will help you to do that. It's also good to remember the distinction between sympathy and empathy. Now, sympathy is about understanding another person's point of view, but really feeling sorry for that person's situation. Empathy is more about understanding the other person's point of view, but not necessarily agreeing with it or feeling sorry for them. It's just about understanding rather than having to align yourself with that person's point of view or their situation. It's important to remember also that you don't really have to have been through exactly what the other person's been through to have empathy. It's about making an effort to try to understand their perspective. So it's worth considering what's happening for your people beneath the waterline of their iceberg. And there are many ways to understand more about what's going on for your people under that waterline. We can have a conversation, we can discuss core values and past experiences that may be shaping their perceptions and behaviour. There's lots of factors that may be at play. Someone may come from a cultural background that makes them hesitant to question leadership or speak up in meetings. Or perhaps one of your team members has had a horrible boss in the past, meaning they are fearful of leaders right now. Whatever the case, it can be useful for leaders to think of the iceberg as a way to open your mind to the possibilities and build empathy for your people. Now, I'm interested in your feedback on this. What do you think about this iceberg model? Do you think it's a useful concept? Why or why not? And what other ways have you tried to build empathy? Leave a comment on the show notes page, thoughtleader.com/209. I'd love to see what you think about this one. And while you're at it, if you like this episode or the podcast in general, it would be great if you could leave a positive review on your podcast player of choice. Helps me get the word out and, spread the good word of thoughtful leadership around the world. And I really appreciate it in advance. Thank you once again for listening today. It's great that you take the time to listen to this sort of leadership content. Hopefully it is helpful for you. And I urge you, obviously, to keep up the thoughtful leadership as usual. And I'll be back next week.